So I think, I mean, one of the most helpful, the most helpful tools initially are objective. And so if you're an Office 365 user, I often encourage people to just turn on workplace analytics if they've not done that, and just spend a period of time being deliberate about structuring your calendar and recording things in your calendar. Because I think sometimes we trick ourselves and we about what's actually going on because we don't record it. And so one of the simplest tools is just spend a couple of weeks and actually diarize, or even if you do it after the event, record when you are recovering, record that time that you were focused, and then take a step back, extract that data, something like workplace analytics, and just say, how much focus time did you have? How many emails did you respond to? How many meetings did you have? And actually come up with a kind of your own dashboard to describe that. That's probably one of the most helpful tools. But then I'll try and integrate it and with other data sources as well. So I'd start to say, so this is what is going on. This is kind of your starting point. How are you responding to that? So how does that, are there patterns associated with your sleep, for example? So use some kind of wearable device, or you can even use a log, a sleep log. I'm pretty sure 80% of the people hit on this podcast, listen to this, using a wearable, but you can just use a sleep log and they're okay. So use some kind of wearable. I'm a big fan of, I've got several wearable devices I use, but I think measuring your sleep, recognizing that there's some limitations in accuracy, but is there an association between the number of meetings you have in a day and how you sleep? Is there an association with your heart rate variability average during the night, for example? Then start putting in overlaying data about the workouts that you're doing, and how that's maybe having an influence. Where is the correlation there? Use some kind of journal feature, like I've used the Streaks app periodically to measure different behaviors, and start to look at kind of if you're doing breathing exercises, for example, or some kind of meditation. And it is kind of stuff that I'm sure people are doing on this podcast already who are listening to it, but building up a data set that says, where are you now? And then starting to identify kind of the different things that could be improved. But I think that the most important step, though, is once you've done that, to just pick one thing that you're going to work on. Because I think that the challenge that you described a moment ago, which is this kind of sense that we have these perfect days followed by kind of all these rubbish days. Sometimes I see that can be a result of us feeling like we need to optimize everything and ending up optimizing nothing.
Yeah.
And so this again goes back to a principle in athletic training, in sports training, in periodization. So there's all kinds of debates around periodization, but essentially the fundamental principle behind it recognizes that it is impossible to optimally adapt or build every capacity simultaneously. And actually there's a case for prioritizing specific capacities and building those capacities at different times. So maybe there's a period focused on building aerobic capacity. Maybe there's a period with a greater emphasis on anaerobic capacity. Maybe there's a period focused on muscular strength or force development or whatever. And so I'd often encourage people to say, okay, we've established now that there's 30 different things you need to do. You need to allocate more time for focus, protect it, switch off notifications, whatever. You need to improve your sleep. You need to reduce the number of meetings. In particular, often one of the things I see consistently is, and I've seen this in some data from my academic research, that there's a quite strong relationship between the time that you finish your last meeting and the time you try to go to sleep, obviously, and what type of thinking you do during that time. So something else we could talk about, whether that thinking is problem-solving pondering or what we call work-related rumination, this perseverative thinking where we struggle to switch off. But when you've evaluated all these, then I'd rank them and I'd say, okay, in terms of where you want to be eventually, what do we need to build first? Not necessarily about what you think is most important, but maybe what's going to have the biggest effect. Also, maybe what things can you do now that are going to make the next things easier? Obviously, we talk about sleep all the time. That pretty much always ends up being the thing if people are not sleeping enough. But break it down and get clear about prioritization. One of the I don't know if anyone on your podcast has talked about this before. I'm sure they have, but there's a phenomenon known as the Zeigarnik effect. And
can you explain that a little bit for everybody?
Yeah, sure. So this is one of the kind of theories which can help to explain why we find it difficult to prioritize because everything feels important. It can also help to explain acutely why we can find it challenging to focus on one task because we're so aware of the other things that we need to do. So essentially, our brains are vulnerable to certain situations that can make it more difficult to prioritize, plan, and focus. And the Zeigarnik effect is a way of describing this vulnerability. So it was named originally after this Soviet psychologist called Zeigarnik, and it describes this experience that we have of continuing to think about a task when we have started it, but we're unable to finish it. And so there's some theories around the Zeigarnik effect that suggest that it might also be responsible for tying up cognitive resources. And so there's been some studies which indicate that people do worse on a brainstorming task if they're prevented from finishing a simple warm-up task beforehand, because that unfinished warm-up task seems to be clogging up their active memory. So in contrast, our cognitive resources are liberated and performance seems to be improved if participants in that study example were able to plan to complete that unfinished task later. But the study makes some interesting points that are relevant here. And one of those points is that those plans needed to be highly specific for them to be successful in eliminating thoughts of unfulfilled goals. So when I've kind of done that process and we thought about, here's the 50 things that you need to do to optimize your life, create some specific plans, but accept that you're not going to do them all straight away. Some of these might be things that you do down the line. And again, start to think about this optimization process like an athlete. I know I need to build strength, but immediately I need to start with endurance. So I'm going to build this endurance base first, for example. That might not be right, but it might be. The point being that you prioritize something, but there will be a specific plan about how you're going to develop your strength later. And it seems to just quieten the brain to free us from that Zeigarnik effect. And there's various tools that I use in practice in terms of that specific planning process, which I can share. But that's kind of tactically how I'd start to think about that process of breaking it down.